So my name is Eddie Rowe, and I'll be your chair for today's Large Systems Working Group session. Welcome to the Large System Working Group stream. On this session, we're going to be joined by Rebecca from 21st Century Software. And if there are any questions throughout the presentation, please place them in the chat. Rebecca has said it's okay to leave the microphones able to be unmuted. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, either use the chat or the microphone function. Final thing before we get going, please provide feedback for this session. This is accessible through the Bring Your Own Agenda on the GSE website, where there's a link to take you to the feedback. This way we can improve the sessions for you. Now I will pass it off to Rebecca. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I do appreciate that. And for all of you that are on this session, thank you so much for joining. I can't see who's here, but I do like to make my sessions interactive. That's why I like them in person. So if you have questions, I have no problem trying to answer it. And we will kind of just go through the presentation. But if you'd rather type them, as Eddie said, please. Interaction is always fun. The topic that we're going to talk about today is about not just cyber resiliency and the regulations, but why is it really so difficult? Why is it that we actually are having a conversation in which we have to do something? You would think that we're mainframes, we're resilient, we're good, right? And so that's kind of the conversation. We need to kind of address what are the areas and some of the areas in which we need to consider and maybe haven't thought about to date. So when we talk about resiliency, many times we think of cyber resiliency or different aspects of resiliency. But really, what we're going to talk about is the fact that resiliency in general is a conversation that just can't be discussed as I'm here. I have this technology. It can't be a static piece. And part of it's because the threats aren't static, but also because the environments are changing. Our environments are changing. We're always putting new things on. We're always doing new things. The mainframe itself is going through a transformation of hybrid cloud and being used to do so much, but it is always and is the center of where all the data is kept. So with that and all the changes that we're seeing, we can't be static. And we can't accept the fact that the way we've done it is the way that we can continue to do it. But then for a second, though, part of the reason why we're having these conversations about resiliency is because of the regulations. For a very long time, we didn't always worry about all the nuances of resiliency. There were risks that as businesses that were just accepted. But the mainframe, as well as all the rest of our IT infrastructure, is under a microscope because the board all of a sudden is concerned about resiliency. They, because of NIS2 and DORA and other legislations, the FCA, are now concerned about where things are going to be. They are going to be accountable. You have to think about it. If you were asked the question, if a board member came to you and you were brought to the board and they said to you, can you recover an application? Do you know where all your backups are? How resilient are we? When was the last time we tested something along those lines? Believe it or not, those are the kinds of things they're going to be concerned about. They're actually concerned with some of the recent legislation that they actually have to do things that they've never had to consider before, whether it's around security, whether it's around resiliency. The concern is there. And let's face it, we know the mainframe is the most resilient, secure platform. But I have to say, I like the word recently that I heard of securable. If we don't have the processes in place, if we haven't done things like pervasive encryption, if we don't have all the resiliency pieces in place, we aren't resilient. We're resilientable. It's the same. And so I think we really have to think about what is our stance, where are we at with things, and really are we putting into place the pieces that are needed for our organizations. You know, the mainframe, it's very positive right now. You know, we've gone through this cyclical piece, and a lot of respondents in this BMC survey said yes. But those customers that said yes and had their thumbs up also are making investments. They're making investments in the technologies and all of the pieces that are surrounding our platform. You know, no one would say that the customer has a future or a growth for this platform if they're running on old technologies. But at the same time, if they're running on these older technologies, they're not as secure as we would like them to be, or they're not as resilient as we would like them to be. So though we have a lot of positive, it means that we have a lot more responsibility to make our platform as secure. And that's kind of the conversation, right? If you're not on the most modern, if you're not resilient, you're not securable. So we can't just do one or the other. We really need, in a modern and in the world of modernization, to make sure that we're intertwining resiliency, security, and all of those pieces. And many people have said to me, but Rebecca, modernization is about the APIs and the applications, and I agree. But modernization is also about how are you actually managing your resiliency? How are you actually managing your security? Can you prove and can you make are you still doing it like you did in the 80s and in the 90s? If you did a DR test today, a flat out test, where you actually had to bring up all of the applications, how would you do that? And would you do it the same way you did it 10 years ago? For a lot of our applications, the answer is yes. So we got to talk about that. We have to really think about why it's a conversation, but can we meet the level of risk tolerance that our businesses now find acceptable? A lot of the reason we didn't make a lot of changes to what we were doing is it was kind of the concept of it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's fair. We also don't want to risk the resilience that we have in the applications. We have zero tolerance for downtime in most organizations. But because we have zero tolerance for downtime, and because we have all these legislative rulings, and because everything is changing, and because we're in a 24/7 world, acceptance for doing things the same way isn't there anymore. And it's that risk tolerance that has changed, not so much what we're doing. So as the risk tolerance has changed, we really need to ask ourselves some very pointed questions. Do we actually understand what the business requires end to end? We have to understand this is no longer just a technology discussion. It's a business discussion all the way up to the board. So if they have the potential of asking you how resilient you are, do we as IT folks, do we actually understand what those requirements are? Are we asking those questions? If we have a process that requires people, and I know that we do, because when you go to talk to folks about application resiliency, what is the first thing they say? Well, it's that person's responsibility for that application or that line of business. Well, if that's the case, then that person is your single point of failure. And is that acceptable, really? How automated are our processes? And I mean our processes across the entire framework. Maybe we have really good infrastructure in place, resiliency. You know, if you're running high availability GDPS and you have all that automation, that is fantastic. It is needed. But what is the process that you have for all of the pieces? And I see there's a question in the chat, and I cannot read the chat. So if you just want to ask it, that would be fine.
Sorry, that was just me saying that if you have any questions, yeah.
Okay, that'd be fine. Also, how are you optimizing this process? Time is your ultimate enemy here. So some customers will say, you know what, we've got it. We can do this. How much time does it take you to do it in? How are you verifying that amount of time? How are you verifying the viability of your recovery process? And do we all really understand the cost to fail? That is key. What is the cost to your business to be down 1 hour, 2 hours? Now we talk about 7 nines, 8 nines, and that's seconds of downtime. Is that across all of our environment or segments of our environment? That is key. So as we have, and we speak to the fact that the mainframe is core to business critical applications, we also understand that it's extremely interconnected. So our weakest link is unfortunately the piece that is going to hold us back. It is going to be what makes us not as resilient as we would like, not as secure as we would like. So as we talk about resilientable and securable, we need to really understand that it's a puzzle. If we think about the Z16, we understand that it is now at 8 nines. Things like dynamically shifting production capacity in the Z16 has made it possible for us to be able to move our data from different sites. We have flex capacity. We have system recovery boosts that you can bring online when you have an issue. I mean, this platform, bar none, is amazing when it comes to that. But have you invested in the latest Z? Have you really been able to show and use the most modern of technologies that are available to you on that platform? And then we have things like GDPS. Again, amazing technology. Failover from one data center to another, the ability for it to be all automated, all things under the covers, fantastic. Then you have parallel sysplex. Again, the ability to bring you to 7 nines when implemented and used properly. Parallel sysplex allows your databases to be spot on, always available where you need them to be. But how many of us are really looking at all the non-database? Now that needs due to leverage analytics, being able to identify the impact of those workloads, being able to bring that segment of your business, just like you would any other segment of the business. They're all tied together. And when they're tied together, that's how you have this ability to have this first-class resiliency that this platform is known for. But part of the reason why this has become so important and all of a sudden is the conversation is because of all the legislation. And it's not just the EU and DORA. That would be a fallacy to think. But if you're doing business in the EU, you need to live to the obligations of DORA. But it's also NIS too. It's also the FCA in the UK. In the US, we're using the SEC. It's all coming from a single source, however. The Basel Committee met in 2021 and started this process with all of these legislations that we are now having to deal with. 45 central banks and a number, I think it's 28 agencies got together and said, we know that we have the capability of all these banks and insurances and critical entities being viable, but unfortunately, we're still having issues. We're still having downtime. There are banks and other entities that actually have gotten to the point where the countries themselves have said, hey, we might have to declare insolvency and do something here. That's not how the EU wants it to be. That's not how the UK wants it to be. That's how no nation state wants it to be. So they're imposing on us stricter regulations, which means we're going to have to look seriously at how we're doing things. The way we've done it isn't going to be able to be the same. Now, the UK is interesting, and I really like the way the UK has gone about doing this. They've shifted away from thinking resiliency is just having data to actually being able to use that data. They want the financial industries and those to be able to supply and provide their external end users and customers their information. For instance, you need to be able to go to your bank and be able to get money. It's not an option. And here's the thing. The businesses, the banks, the insurances, and customer-facing entities have to be able to prove that to the FCA. And that's different now, right? And they actually have to have reasonable use cases, which is also different. Now, it's interesting also to note that the UK resiliency, and on these links you can have when you get the presentation, really show that it's about operational resilience. So a lot of times we want to think, well, as long as I have the data, I'm good. But this concept of plausible disruption is really key. And that means we have to get beyond just having data. We actually have to be able to show that we can use it. And I think that is key. Now, when you get this, there's a link here to actually a questionnaire that you can actually look at, and it will guide you through. Now, in this case, this one happens to be for CyberVault, but they also have put one out that is for operational resilience. That is key. And you as businesses, you as end users, you can actually get these and use them. And it's important because that's what you want to do. You want to help your organization be more resilient. Now, what about the operational resilience being driven in the EU? Now, it's interesting because they are using DORA, and that's for banking, insurance, and financial markets. They also have the Cyber Resiliency Act. They also have NIS2, which is a directive. Now, there's a difference between a regulation and a directive. A regulation is from the EU itself, and it's a must-have across all nation states. A directive has to be approved by the individual nation states, and there's some variability in what your individual country will do. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that NIS2 in some countries is actually more stringent than DORA, and in others less. But here's the interesting part. Whoever's more stringent is the one who will supersede. In other words, you have to know what your individual country is doing. You have to understand with NIS2, and this one comes into effect in October of this year. And you need to be able to say, hey, is it tighter or less tight than DORA? And what do I need to do to be obliging to fulfill it? And it's not, and what's also interesting is this whole concept of critical entities. That includes anything like energy, transport, water, public sector. So interestingly, sometimes it's the public sector that will say, yeah, but we're part of the government. Yeah, well, you have your own directives that are coming down just for you. So that means that across all of the EU, if you're doing business in the EU, you have to abide by these rules. If you're from the EU and you're doing business in the UK, you're also going to have to abide by these rules. These rules don't have boundaries if you're doing business, and that's also key. So let's look a little bit closer at the resiliency and the DORA Act itself. Because sometimes people say, well, you know, does it really say that? Well, yes, it does. If you look at Article 6, it actually says that you have to have accurate information based upon analytics. It also mentions very clearly that you have to automate the backup and recovery processes. So earlier I asked you, can you ask these questions of yourself, right? Well, they're important questions to ask. It also says that you have to be able to automatically capture your library changes. You have to back up the members, and you have to quickly restore them for rollback. That's how precise these rulings are. In Article 10 of DORA, they want you to simulate a recovery. They want you to automatic and track a recovery in an event. And then Article 11 of the DORA really kind of gets very specific. They want you to maintain a complete inventory of your backups for any method. They want you to test for those exposures. They want you to have an inventory of all your data. Think about if you have a snapshot, can you actually inventory all the data sets in there? What about a flash copy? Having all of this information at your fingertips is now something you need to do, which means we have to change the way we look at some of our recovery processes. They have to be more automated. What's also interesting is if you look at the exact wordings, which is in this slide, you can see that my previous slide, though I was trying to be a little more specific and help to speak to it, the exact words are right here. So being able to do this becomes more and more important if you're truly going to be able to meet these requirements. Now, there's lots of other requirements. And to be fair, that means that it's not, as I said earlier, a single solution. It is a puzzle. And we have to be open to seeing all the pieces that are necessary. Being able to test, being able to do all these things is extremely important. And one of the things I noted here is for service providers. They additionally have to maintain the adequate resources, which is interesting, right? They actually have to make sure that they can help their customers with a timely restoration. It's across everybody. It's not just the customer's responsibility, it's also the outsourcer's responsibility. And they're putting some of that responsibility on the third parties, which changes the dynamic. Again, resiliency is about your infrastructure and all your applications. It's the entire piece. And many times I get told, hey, our business we're not really worried about it. It doesn't affect our business. And I get that. But what's interesting here is this is a critical entities directive. Look what's in here as well. Financial markets and banking. Why is it here? Because these are different rules. You'll have more rules, but it includes everybody this time. These are directives, so the individual nation states are going to determine what they are. But some folks say, well, maybe that doesn't apply to the UK or it doesn't apply to the US. Well, that's not true. In the US, we didn't put out a nice little list like this, but all through COVID and still, each individual agency and group is putting out different rules that are directives for critical entities, and they have to be resilient. The same with UK. So just because we're in a specific industry that you don't think is financial does not take away the need. You might have a little bit more time because DORA is already in effect in January of 2025. NIS 2 is already going to be in effect in October of 2024. So critical entities might see themselves having a bit more time to get ready, but you still need to do it. And then there's countries like Switzerland with FINMA, again, addressing it. And then there's the US. And the interesting thing about the US is, yes, we have governmental regulations, but the US actually has a group. It's actually an organization. It's a not-for-profit that's made up of the CEOs and top management of the major banks. And they came together and formed Sheltered Harbor, and they established their own standard because they recognize that once improbable is now plausible. And they've actually been doing this for some time. I think it started in 2015. So before it became something that was everybody, they were already aware that something needed to change. And so the focus on resiliency is key. So the question becomes, what can we do now? We know we have these regulations. We know that we have to do things. And this isn't a scare tactic. This isn't, hey, you know, Rebecca is making this. This is things we just have to deal with. It's part of the regulatory. We know that happens. We have GDPR. Now we're going to have all these ones around resiliency, and we also have the things around security. So what does Gartner say for us to do? Gartner's always a third party in all of this, right? Well, it says you really need to kind of sit down and go through the process. Now, what's interesting is that you really have to establish a management process in all of this. It's not just an IT problem, right? It's an overarching problem. So though we have robust and we can validate our disaster recovery strategies and processes, we also have to have mature plans in place that we can show our management for response, right? And one of the things that's really, really important is the testing. The testing, the testing, the testing. And it's not just tabletops. The good old days of actually doing DR tests is back. And the cheating's not going to be allowed. And we all know that we did it because that's how we could recover and that's how we could pass the audits. It's not so much just about passing the audit, it's about actually making sure your businesses run. And I think that's what's key. And I've been talking a lot about resiliency in the last few years. And one of the things that has struck me is sometimes people get a little, hey, all these rules, it really shouldn't have ever had to be rules in the first place, right? If we know that we're not resilient, if we know we have gaps, we really should be making sure that our businesses are running so that our customers are secure in what we're providing. So all of these things that are here, whether it's for legislation or it's just because it's good business practice, are things that we need to do now. Yes, to be ready for these rules because they're now, but also because it's the right business thing to do. And if you think that you're secure and you think that you can do it, push the button. To be fair, this is what a safeguarded copy is. This is what a flash copy is. This is what a true DR test would be. And not just of the infrastructure. And I think that's the important piece here. We've gotten very good at the infrastructure, but the applications, that's where the business is going to be different. And there's some tools that you can use. A product like IBM ZBatch Resiliency will allow you to get that single source of truth for an area of the business that we tend to ignore. Our batch, our VSAM, our sequential. I mean, how many of us right now could go and ask somebody in our organization where all of your batch backups are? That you can account for where they're located, that you could roll back and roll forward, that you could get in your safeguarded copy an inventory of every data set. That's key. Additionally, we have to, because of the rulings, put into place things like a change tracking. We really need to be able to have something that's system-wide and control and puts in the controls for those libraries. It's not okay anymore to just let the sysprods do it, though we understand that they're a very trusted part of our organization. We have to, unfortunately, with zero trust and all the other pieces that are in place, have means in which we can back out problems that might occur, but also prove to the auditors that we tracked and we audited and we put the right processes in place so that if an issue did happen, we can show that we did everything in our power to do it and be able to get out of that problem quickly. And why has it become so important? It's become important because it's happening. It's become important for us to do these things because the breaches are increasing. And one of the things that we on the mainframe have to acknowledge is the impact to the business. The average cost of a mega breach, and that's any organization over 1 million records, stands at $304 million. That's a lot. The average ability to contain a breach is longer than is acceptable. So it is important for us to look at it not as a if it will happen. Unfortunately, it's more of a it will happen. Just recently, probably, I don't know if it was in the news, but it was definitely in the news in the States, our largest healthcare provider was breached. And it's amazing the work that they're doing now in order to shore up. And one of the areas that they're shoring up is applications. This was an area that they realized was maybe not being looked at. Exceptions were being given. The upgrades and the necessary pieces that were needed weren't always done. That's not the case anymore. They are very strategically making sure that every aspect of their business is as secure. And they're making it very clear it's not just infrastructure. What was clear is they could get the data. What wasn't able to be done is to use it as effectively and as quickly as they needed to. And I think that's the key to the costs that you see here on this page. Having data and using data is two different things. Proving you can use it is what makes these costs go down. So we've talked about the mainframe. We feel good about it. We figured it out. But now let's talk a little bit about cloud data. We have to, because we're always talking about cloud, aren't we? And isn't that where a lot of the breaches end up happening? The numbers are astounding. 82% of them come from that area. Now, in the US, the average is 4.75 million. Now, understand that that's an average. And that means that from anybody from the mom and pop to a client server-based organization, even in mainframe inclusive, brings that number up. Now, it also means that if we're connected to all of these pieces within our organizations, then the breach can come in. So we can feel very confident about ourselves, and that's good. We can make sure that all of our pieces on the mainframe are good, but that doesn't mean that our organization doesn't have to have this conversation about how all of the pieces tie together. And we can't ignore the data that you've put out on the cloud. We can't assume that just because we're using a SaaS provider that they are taking care of it. First of all, the regulators are saying it's your responsibility. If you have data out there, it's on you. But at the same time, they are being imposed. There's more imposing of rules that make them accountable. But where your data resides, what the data is doing, it's the customer's responsibility. And they can't, please do not assume that it is taken care of. And just because contractually there may be some lines in there that say they're doing it, how are they doing it? Is it to the specs and the requirements that your business now needs? Did you sign the contract 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Believe it or not, SaaS providers are now legacy. What we've done and put out there is now even legacy, and those contracts may not live to the standard you need today. So all of these things need to be considered and all reviewed so that we can be as clear as we need to about these things. And to be fair, resiliency is truly a precursor to cyber resiliency. If you are not able to recover from an operational event, if you don't have backups in place, if you don't have processes in place, if you're not testing, how are you going to recover just because you have an immutable copy? The immutable copy in and of itself does not prove that you actually can recover the applications. It's the process of being operational, being recoverable, and being able to test it and prove it that assures and makes you more probable that you can recover. But think about it. When you have a cyber incident or you have an incident that requires you to use your immutable copy, first of all, you're having a really bad day. Secondly, you've had to ask permission and get a business decision to be able to get to that data. So that takes time in and of itself. And then you're going to have to recover at points and times that maybe you've never tested for. And maybe with data that's not as good because of ransom or other pieces. So we need to prove that we can be resilient. But not only are we want to be able to prove we're resilient and then be cyber resilient, we also need to consider security. I grew up on a farm. If you don't make sure you have your security in place pervasively, then it's kind of like the barn doors open. You can put all the resiliency in place. You can have as many copies as you want in place, but without the proper security, how are you going to actually protect the data? So this isn't an area we can all ignore. We have to be able to look at both of them extremely importantly. And it's not just IT. The business has to be engaged. So many times I get told that these areas are insurance policies, or there's something that is someone else's job, or is optional. Well, that's not the case anymore. It's not, it isn't, and we all have to be engaged. We need to understand what the business requires and then do it. I want to share why I think it's so closely aligned. If you think about this cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, this is what they recommend, right? Keep an updated operating system and software. Well, that's what you do for resiliency. Create offline backups to multiple locations. Well, that's what you need to do for resiliency. Test the backup demonstrations. That's what we have to do for resiliency. Now, one of the things they require that maybe you don't do for resiliency is implement end-to-end encryption, but we have to consider it. And we have to consider it in our resiliency strategy, because how are you going to recover if there's a problem with the encryption? They're intertwined. They work together. And we have to really think about it. It's not just about the recovery itself and the testing, but we also have to think about things like zero trust. We have to think about things like an incident response plan. How many of us even know if our organization has an incident response plan? What is that incident response plan? What is our role in that incident response plan? It's all questions that we ask. Now, we showed that we have all these rules around resiliency. There's some that are coming down. NIST 2 is one. NIST is another. PCI DSS. But the PCI DSS is probably the one that is going to hit us first. And this has been the most clear in their statement of what you need to do with encryption. The statement is, while disk encryption may still be present on these devices, it cannot be the only mechanism used to protect PAN data stored on those systems. And the mainframe, we feel very secure, right? Because we have our hardware is encryption, our storage is encrypted. It's part of what we started doing in the Z14 and above very easily. That's not enough anymore. And that's why pervasive encryption. And so there's tools to help you with that. And this is a growing area within IBM. And it's an area that a lot of organizations are really, really talking about and doing a lot about. So it's an area of growth and an area we need to look into. And a lot of times, though, no matter what we say, and no matter how important it is, we still need to come up with ROIs. So if 304 million average incident isn't enough, and the fact that the incidences are increasing isn't enough, then here's an example of an ROI document that I found, whether or not it can work for you. But this is from the Center of Information Security, and the cost of a data breach that I noted earlier is from the Ponemon Institute. Now, I think it's important for us on the mainframe to be clear that we stop using the $4 million item number. We're a mega. And if we have something that goes south, it's going to affect us and be more costly. We in some senses need to start using the numbers that really are associated with our business and our size. And so when we go and we do these ROIs, the reduction in risk is basically what's the chance of it occurring? What's the expected monetary loss? Gartner says 300,000 at least an hour. And then the probability of the risk. It's a pretty straightforward. And the fact is, it's happening more and more. So these are the numbers and a possible way in which you can do it. What's super important for everyone to understand is we're not going to just be resilient. We're not going to wake up one day and have everything in place and everything's going to be done. It doesn't work that way. This is an area that is going to continue to change, to shift, to deal with the threats, to change, to deal with the change in the way we do our business, the way that IT changes. Just think about all the things that have changed in the last 5 years alone. The stronger the technology becomes, the more we have to be in our strategies and the things we have to change in order for us to meet the strength of the technology. So resiliency is going to be an ongoing piece. And it's part of what we're doing on the IT side is just a piece of all the different pieces that need to be done. We're just a small part of it, but we're an important part of it. And it's not an I sport, it's a team sport. And it means as part of our strategy, we really need to help the business realize it's not an IT project. And that's sometimes hard, right? Because a lot of times they look to IT infrastructure to be the piece of the business that's going to protect them from all of these things. But it's not just the IT area. It's a business decision, and the business has to share in the responsibility and in the support. So what happens if you don't plan? Now, we've all seen this. We know that these things happen, but it costs money when it happens. The interesting piece here is that this incident, when it happened, they paid the $32 million to the customers, and they did what they needed to do. What was really hard to read was in this document of 115 pages that the UK Central Bank put forth, and in the fines that they gave, it was 5 years later. And what they did is they really looked at what was the strategy, what was the way that this business was running. What they found was that they were ignoring areas of their resiliency, not just for this incident, but over a period of time. So the 42 million pounds that was added to their fines was due to the fact that it was systemic. So think about it. This can happen, and it can happen easily. If your organization says, hey, we're going to just keep things steady state, we're not going to invest. That's not what you can do in this area. You have to invest. Or we're going to go off this platform, so we're not going to put any more money into it. Well, you have to. If you don't have the resiliency to the measures that you need to put the money in. You need to stay current. Until you're off, you need to make sure that you so systemically make a decision that will cost you this fine and the embarrassment. And the CIO, they held them personally responsible at 116 pounds. The CEO was gone. The board no longer exists that it was at that time. People paid the price. The customers did. The people who were working there did. And it was because decisions were made that, from a business perspective, they said, where IT should have. And the business and the board should have listened to the IT folks when they said, hey, this isn't so good, or we're not as resilient. But they also said that IT made decisions that they shouldn't have, and they should have let the business decide. And that, I think, is really important for us to remember. We're all in it together. We can't make the decisions in vacuums. And sometimes, because of the silos of organizations, that happens. Things get done in an IT way, or in an application way, or in a business, without the communication of understanding what risks can be implied by how that happens and how those decisions get made. So this went faster because I'm not in person than when I'm in person. But we really, really don't want to be this person. To be truly resilient, first of all, yes, we do have to modernize. We have to be updated. We have to be current. Nothing will go or go away. It will not work with old technology. We have to be current. And we have to really just do the right thing. This isn't scaring and saying, oh, these regulations. No, it's the right thing to do. And it's everyone's job. But because of the regulations, we're running out of time to do it. So it is a matter of now. It's not a matter of when. And we all need to be a part of solving this. And ultimately, it's good for everyone, because our businesses will run better, we'll be more secure, and we'll feel confident. A lot of the documentation that I had in this presentation is found in all of these that you can use. So please do so so that you can make your case for enhancing your business and your environment. And I want to thank you. Are there any questions?
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. If you have any questions, please, you should be able to unmute yourself or ask them in the chat.
So from did this make sense for folks? I just want to get thumbs up, thumbs down, made sense, not made sense. Valuable, not valuable. Okay. If you have questions, if you just want to go one-on-one, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at 21CS. This is an area that I enjoy talking to. So please ask me anything, and I'd be more than happy to have a one-on-one with you as well. Okay. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. So
thanks.
if no more questions, I'd like to
good.
thank you for everyone for attending the Large System Working Group stream today. And the session name is Cyber Resiliency DORA Regulations, Why Being Resilient is So Difficult. So just a quick reminder to please give some feedback. It really does help improve the sessions. So thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone. Bye-bye.